The title of my talk comes from a famous etching by Francisco Goya, the 18th century Spanish painter, who depicted both royal scenes and common people in his work. The full title of the etching is "The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters," or at least that's one of the titles Goya gave it. A bit of trivia I'll return to later. Now, here's an image of it, and those of you on Zoom can see it on your screen. The drowsing writer or artist, his head dropped onto his folded arms, has fallen asleep. And around his head, or perhaps from his head, fly owls and bats. There's what appears to be a bobcat or lynx in the corner. As indicated by the motto on the desk, the implication is that as soon as we let our reason go to sleep, or what we might nowadays call our critical thinking skills, all kinds of scary things are likely to pop up. I take some pride in my thinking skills, so this is a line of reasoning I'm inclined to agree with. I say all of this by way of an introduction to a book I've been reading, which looks at the sleep of reason in our present day. The title of the book is Dying of Whiteness, and it's by Jonathan Metzl. Jonathan Metzl is a physician, born and raised in the Kansas City area, who now practices with the Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville. Metzl became interested in the question why so many people nowadays appear to behave in ways that are contrary to their own interests, especially in the political realm. And he set about investigating this question from his perspective, that of a medical researcher, not a political scientist. The book reads more like a public health study than a political tract. The book covers several issues, but I want to focus on two: gun laws in Missouri and healthcare reform in Tennessee. Here's what happened in each state. In 2012, the state of Tennessee refused to extend Medicaid after the Supreme Court ruled that the Affordable Care Act's expansion of Medicaid was a decision that had to be left up to the states. And in 2016, the Missouri legislature passed what became known as the Guns Everywhere Act over the veto of then Governor Jay Nixon. This law expanded the so-called Castle Doctrine and Stand Your Ground provisions of Missouri law, and it eliminated the background check and permit requirements for carrying a concealed weapon. Comedians started referring to Missouri as the shoot me state. I'm not giving anything away by telling you the results of his study, and you've probably guessed them already. In Tennessee, where there was an easy comparison state in Kentucky, its neighbor, which did expand Medicaid, health outcomes lagged. From his analysis of the data, Metzl estimates that the refusal to expand Medicaid cost white Tennesseans, on average, a little over 14 days of life. And in Missouri, where the relaxation of gun laws had actually begun in 2007, and was trumpeted as a victory for freedom and for the ability of law-abiding citizens to defend themselves, Missouri became less and less safe over those years. By Metzl's calculation, between 2007 and 2015, lax gun laws cost the state $273 million in lost work, and ultimately over 10,000 years of productive life among one segment of its population. All this is pretty straightforward, but Metzl goes further in his analysis, and that's where things get interesting. The effects of these policies were destructive, but the destructiveness was not shared equally. In both states, the people who supported these decisions were significantly harmed by them. In Tennessee, Metzl conducted interviews and focus groups and carefully dissected official statements and press accounts. And the reason most commonly stated for opposing Medicaid expansion was, quote, socialized medicine, or its harsher cousin, socialism, or its softer euphemism, government overreach. But when he probed those reasons more deeply in personal conversations, the underlying motivation revealed itself, and it was resentment. Not resentment of government so much, but resentment of the supposedly undeserving people who might receive the benefits. Some of you may remember H.L. Mencken's famous definition of Puritanism as the haunting fear that someone somewhere may be happy. What Metzl found was that in Tennessee, resistance to Medicaid expansion was driven by the haunting fear that someone somewhere may get medicine or medical treatment that they somehow didn't deserve. The preponderance of people who held this belief were white men. And in the hypothetical scenarios they constructed to justify their opposition, the undeserving recipients were almost always people of color. Mexicans, Black people, immigrants of all sorts. So behind the generalizations about government was a coded, usually unspoken, but clearly present feeling of racial resentment. When Metzl looked at the health data to see who suffered from Tennessee's failure to expand Medicaid, his bottom line finding was that all Tennesseans suffered. But Black Tennesseans lost the most, an estimated average of 37 days of life between 2011 and 2015. But white Tennesseans lost as well, an estimated average of 14 days of life. So although the refusal to expand Medicaid did accomplish the unspoken goal of keeping undesirable people from receiving health care, it did so at a terrible cost. The case of Missouri is, if anything, even sadder. The mythology of gun ownership is so entrenched, so essential to identity, that politicians in Missouri felt no need to justify loosening the restrictions on guns beyond vague gestures toward freedom and safety. There's no such thing as absolute freedom or total safety. But such a distinction was lost on the Missouri legislators, who saw a political advantage in being able to portray themselves as tough on crime and defenders of freedom, without having to inquire into what actually causes crime or protects freedom. Turns out living in a state where guns are easily accessible doesn't bring about a lower crime rate. What it does happen is pretty predictable, and I'm sorry to have to speak about difficult subjects, but so it is. So there are lots of guns around. Little kids will pick them up. Teenagers will goof around and show off. And troubled people will reach for them in a moment of stress and perform an irreversible act of harm to themselves. The Missouri section of Metzl's book is perhaps the most striking because it hits closest to home. Political support for relaxed gun laws is stronger among white males than in any other demographic group. But in painstaking detail, he breaks down death rates to show that white males are precisely the same group that suffers the most when gun availability is relaxed. Not so much through being crime victims, but through the less publicized means of accident and suicide. The very people who advocate for more access to guns are the ones who bear the brunt of that access. And tragically, as he goes on to show, the power of the rhetoric and mythology that surrounds gun ownership in America is so strong that it overcomes dry statistics or even personal experience. Metzel describes his visits to a survivors support group in Cape Girardeau, where a grieving mother named June tells him, "Guns are a way of life around here." A sentiment echoed by the group's co-leader, Billy, who adds, "I don't think any of us blame the gun. It's not the gun's fault." Billy is factually correct. The slogan that guns don't kill people, people kill people, is a technically accurate statement. It obscures a broader truth. When there are a lot of guns around, it's easier for people to kill people, themselves or others, on purpose or by accident. And we as a society need to have a rational discussion about how easy we want to make it. That discussion isn't happening because our reason is asleep on this issue. And those who are in favor of more restriction on guns are in some ways not helping either when they focus on the high-profile mass shootings in the country, because that's an emotionally powerful way of framing the issue. But the bulk of the carnage caused by guns happens one shot at a time, one person at a time. So we see dueling sets of emotional appeals and little chance of common ground. Metzel's subtitle in his book is "How the Politics of Racial Resentment is Killing America's Heartland." And while that's a useful description, I don't think it quite covers everything. A recent article on NPR about our current political state put it differently, and I'm quoting here. "What we hear in contemporary media is not an attempt to find facts that might be agreed upon, but rather a continuing competition between narratives, a wrestling match pitting one version of events against another. Each side sees its narrative as factual. Each side sees the others as an elaborate fiction, the product of corrupt spinners of fanciful falsehoods. It's easy for me to see the logical flaws in an adversary's narrative, their loose generalizations and unexamined assumptions. But it's hard for me to see my own. And here's the great challenge in this. People don't base their decisions on facts and reason alone. If I approach someone who differs from me with the belief that I am right and you are wrong, I will never win that person over. Especially if that person differs from me based on strongly held beliefs and a compelling narrative, no matter how irrational. In fact, taking this approach often makes the other person simply dig in deeper. In Tennessee, Metzel interviewed a 40-year-old uninsured cab driver with a basically fatal case of hepatitis C, who staunchly supported the stance taken by his elected officials. When asked why he supported restricting Medicaid despite his own eligibility and his life-threatening illness, the man said, "I'd rather die. We don't need any more government in our lives. In any case, no way I want my tax dollars paying for Mexicans or welfare queens." This is not someone who will be won over by the rules of Lincoln-Douglas debate. And certainly the past few years have brought us many more examples of this kind of irrationality, from our anti-vaccine neighbors who both came down with nearly fatal cases of COVID, true story, to everyone's goofy uncle who insists without a shred of evidence that the 2020 election was somehow stolen and that its results can be reversed 2 years later. These are not sensible ideas, and they seem impervious to reason. But the people who hold them are in many cases our friends and loved ones, and it feels wrong to simply walk away. But what can you do if you can't argue somebody out of a cherished false belief? I can't pretend to have an answer, but I have a few thoughts. Not to point out the obvious, but crazy ideas don't just come from nowhere. They are promoted by somebody with something to gain, whether it's money, power, or something else. I'm not saying Uncle Bob isn't responsible for his beliefs, but I do think we should keep in mind that he's probably getting them from someone who has no interest in correcting them and every interest in perpetuating them. So we need to give Uncle Bob an alternative. Switch the channel when you visit, or send him that link to an article. And if he complains, explain your reason. At least you will have started a conversation. Lest we imagine that supporting policies that are not in your own best interest is strictly a conservative problem, let me point out that liberals have their own blind spots and myths too. A recent news story on PBS went into great length about how the University of California at Berkeley is trying to improve its diversity in an institution in which enrollment of students of color is just under 70%. And while the legalization of recreational marijuana is a widely held liberal position, its advocates rarely come to grips with the inevitable consequences of this position, which will include the health effects of sustained smoking and new forms of impaired driving. And if you ever lived or worked near a weed smoker, you know that secondhand smoke is not merely a problem of tobacco. When I read Dying of Whiteness, I was struck by how much of the respondents' thinking was governed by fear and identity. These are powerful emotions, and they help to explain the fierceness with which people hold on to their beliefs. If my identity is wrapped up in being white, or being male, or heterosexual, and I sense that identity is being threatened in some way, then I will defend that identity as if my life depended on it, because in a certain way it does. The way to contend with an irrational mythological narrative is to build a more rational, friendly alternate narrative. Instead of an America that is a wrestling match, pitting one version of events against each other, with those on the other side cast as corrupt spinners of fanciful falsehoods. Try telling a story in which everyone has fears and desires, and is trying their best to overcome those fears and attain their desires, each in our own imperfect way. This is not the task of a day or even a year. When I despair about our ability to get people to let go of dangerous, ill-conceived beliefs, I think back to a couple of massive changes that have occurred in my lifetime. When I was young, cars all came equipped with cigarette lighters and ashtrays, and they did not come equipped with seat belts. I remember sitting in my college classes while the professor smoked one cigarette after another until the front of the classroom was a thick cloud. And I remember the debates among my friends about whether they would choose to buckle up, with some arguing that a seatbelt would only trap you in a burning or submerged vehicle. Today, we look back on those things in disbelief. I buckle my seatbelt without even thinking. And the smell of cigarette smoke, even outdoors, is rare enough, allowing the widespread use of tobacco anywhere seems unbelievable. But here we are. Bad but popular ideas have been replaced by good ones. And that brings me back to the sleep of reason one last time. The full epigraph to that etching is different. It reads like this: Fantasy, abandoned by reason, produces impossible monsters. United with her, she is the mother of the arts and the origin of their marvels. Goya is not telling us to do away with our cherished myths and fantasies. He wants us to marry them to our reason and create stories that will guide us to a better place, not frighten us with imaginary bats.